Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. A place where absolutely nothing exciting has happened in 843 years. And that's how the villagers like it. So fluff your pillow, fold your worries like yesterday's laundry, and press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Let us begin in the village of Nether Slothy. That's right, Nether Slothy, which manages to sound like it's halfway between a forgotten sock drawer and an unsweetened digestive biscuit. Nestled in the soggiest corner of the English Midlands, Nether Slothy boasts a population of 73, 14 hedgehogs, and a weather report that just says drizzle on repeat. Now, Reverend Charles Archibald Huffendown, who compiled the village's sole historical record in 1794, entitled A Brief Look at Absolutely Nothing Remarkable, wrote of Nether Slothy, "It is a place admirably untouched by progress, passers-by, or news of any kind." He was quite pleased about that, and so were his sheep. The year is 1637. Not that it matters much here. In London, people are busy discovering coffee. In France, Baroque composers are wearing wigs big enough to qualify as small real estate. But here, in dear Slothy, nothing pumps like the heart of a cabbage patch. Each cottage is made from stone that looks like it gave up halfway through being useful. The roofs are thatched so thickly the rain slows down just to sip a bit of tea before dripping through. And if you're looking for action, the local highlight is watching moss grow on the west side of the church, which, according to Mrs. Pewterbottom, is faster than the east side and thus a touch inappropriate. Life in Nether Slothy drifts like steam from a cup of chamomile. At the edge of the village lanes, hedgerows curve in quiet gossip, whispering news of a cow who sat down unusually early one Thursday. Villagers walk past puddles deliberately, just to see where their boots are leaking this week. And then there's old Tom Butterwick, the oldest man in the village and possibly in the county. No one knows his age exactly, not even Tom. He simply says he's older than spades, but younger than dragons. Each afternoon, he sits on a stump and watches the clouds argue. When asked for wisdom, he rubs his chin thoughtfully and replies, "Well, the trick to a good nap is to pretend you're not taking one. Then, if anyone walks in, you're just thinking very slowly." It's the kind of place where the biggest mystery isn't who took the silver spoon. It was Mildred, and she gave it back. It's how the post office manages to arrive when no mail is sent or received. There is, however, one claim to fame. Though it is such a modest claim, it tends to apologize for itself. You see, somewhere near the sheep field, the large one, not the medium one, lies the exact geographical center of boredom in the British Isles. This was determined by an 18th century surveyor named Giles Thistlewhip, who got lost on purpose to avoid his own wedding and ended up here. According to his journal, "I have found it, the village where the grass snores." The villagers were so honored by this designation that they held a modest celebration consisting of tepid soup and a group sigh. Since then, they've maintained their status scrupulously. No monument was built, of course. That's too exciting. Instead, there's a small flat pebble that wobbles when stepped on. Giles's name is remembered only by the church goose, who might be his reincarnation. In the evenings, a mist settles across the village like a damp duvet. Fires crackle gently behind windows, and shadows of rocking chairs flicker against wallpaper that hasn't been replaced since Henry VIII was still collecting wives. Lamp oil burns slow, and the night hums faintly with the sound of cricket knees creaking in the wet grass. Here, time forgets itself on purpose. not out of rudeness, but for the sheer pleasure of doing nothing in particular for as long as politely possible. And the biggest miracle of all, everyone in Nether Slothy is delightfully content with it. And so, as the rain makes polite introductions on your window pane and the wind tiptoes past the garden gate, we leave the villagers just where they prefer to be, precisely where they were. Tomorrow, perhaps, we'll meet the village clockmaker. But be warned, he hasn't touched a clock since 1542, and with good, boring reason. Nestled peacefully between fields of damp wool and sighing hedgerows, the village of Nether Slothy had, by unanimous agreement among locals, never been accused of excitement, or indeed of anything at all. Rain fell there in a kind of gentlemanly drizzle, not the rude, sideways kind that slaps you on the cheek like a Shakespearean insult, but a courteous, steady rain, the sort that says, "Pardon the interruption, just freshening up the moss." It's important to note, dear listener, that the buildings of Nether Slothy have not changed so much as tilted over time. The village church, with its mildly confused steeple, leans just enough to look curious, but not ambitious. The stone cottages, many of which are older than cricket, and at least twice as weathered, sit huddled together like gossiping great aunts under knitted roofs of ancient thatch. Should you ever find yourself in the town square, and odds are low, unless you're lost, very polite, or a duck, you'll encounter a statue of someone who is almost remembered, Sir Reggie of the Mild Deed, a knight famed for politely declining to go on the Crusades because his mum needed help with the washing up. The statue is made of a pebbled substance known only to local geologists as mostly limestone, probably, and wears a perpetually bewildered expression, as though even he isn't quite sure what he did to deserve a plaque. And what a plaque it is. Its inscription reads, "To Sir Reginald D. Fairweather, who once asked if everyone had considered not going to battle and instead staying home with a nice biscuit." There was a heated village debate in 1863 about whether biscuit should be singular or plural on the plaque, but the verger fell asleep during the meeting and the matter was never brought up again. Now, if you wandered Nether Slothy in the 17th century, you'd have discovered even less. The population then was 47, if you counted the goats. On Tuesdays, the village midwife doubled as the postman, and on Wednesdays, the vicar ran a modest pottery class for people who weren't particularly good at pottery. No one expected much, including the clay. The average daily excitement index in Nether Slothy, should such a thing ever be measured, would hover gently around lightly bemused. A runaway wheelbarrow once caused a bit of a stir in 1734, but it bumped harmlessly into a hedge and was later praised for its gentle descent into chaos. Even the local legends were underwhelming. There was the tale of the slightly haunted spoon, which allegedly stirred on its own once during a particularly windy February, or the rumour that old Martha Thistlewit could predict weather patterns by the way her cat blinked, but only when the cat was awake, which wasn't often. But don't mistake this boredom for dullness. No, Nether Slothy was a place of deep, cosy stillness, where the sky never raised its voice and clouds were careful not to rush, where trouble was seen coming a full fortnight in advance and usually turned around out of politeness. In winter, time thickened. The air carried the smell of tea leaves and damp woolen mittens, and every home boasted at least one chair so comfortable it could trap a person's ambitions for decades. Villagers often sat in these chairs remembering things that might not have happened, and commenting sagely on how they missed the old turnips, though no one knew which ones those were. It's said that the only recorded crime in Nether Slowly was the mysterious vanishing of several plum puddings in the year 1922. A suspect was never found, though a sheep with suspiciously sticky wool was reported loitering near the scene. The constable at the time, one Constable Tibbins, concluded in his report that pudding theft is likely an act of God, or possibly just someone being very hungry and polite enough not to leave a mess. And that's how Nether Slowly remained, gloriously uneventful, serenely overlooked by time, weather, and progress alike. As the rain continued its gracious descent on mossy stones and crisp hedge lines, the village settled into the kind of hush that only ancient boredom can bring. A hush older than any war and softer than any victory. And beyond the curling smoke of chimneys and the soft clink of teacups in aging parlours, something vaguely interesting was about to nearly happen. Softly now, let's drift toward that almost event, just over the cobbled hill. Wind whispers through the mossy shingles of Upper Fromlinshire's snug little rooftops, where rain kisses slate like an old friend returned. You might think that nothing ever moved in this village unless coaxed by a stiff breeze or an especially interested sheep, and in many respects, you'd be exactly right. But tucked between two humming hedgerows and one perpetually apologetic rosebush lay a cottage where time, technically speaking, was supposed to live. It was the home of Edgar Purley, the village's only clockmaker, and possibly the only clockmaker in the known world, who was deliberately late for everything, including fixing clocks. You see, Edgar believed, quite firmly, that punctuality was the mother of ulcers, and that nothing caused more stress than hurrying to arrive somewhere one didn't particularly want to be. His own cuckoo clock, defiantly hooting the wrong hour since 1937, was a kind of protest. He had named it Bertram and insisted it squawked on principle. But Edgar hadn't always been a horological slacker. No, in the sprightly spring of 1922, Edgar had been a rising star in London's highly competitive, impeccably punctual Guild of Mechanical Time. There, among rows of glittering grandfather clocks and the sharpened monocles of judgmental peers, he had nearly won the Golden Pendulum Prize for his innovative invention, the teaspoon timer. It was a pocket watch with one button, marked simply biscuit, that pinged whenever tea had cooled to precisely 54 degrees, the optimal dunking temperature for digestive biscuits. Historians sadly agree that Edgar fell from favour shortly after the boiling teapot incident at the Guild's annual Equinox Banquet of Time. Details are murky due to a scorched ledger and one memorably flustered butler, but suffice to say, Edgar's timer did its job too efficiently, triggering a rhythmic chain of tabletop tea spillage that resulted in a very damp Chancellor of Sundials. After that, Edgar retreated from the bustling hands of the Metropolitan Clock elite and moved where time itself appeared allergic to movement. Ah yes, Upper Fromlinshire. There, even the dogs walked in slow motion, and it was generally agreed that May arrived somewhere in late June. For Edgar, it was paradise. His workshop, the ticklish cog, sat in the back garden beneath a honey-coloured arbour of forgetting. Inside, it smelled of lavender wax and oatmeal biscuits. Everything glowed golden with both nostalgia and a suspicious layer of soot that no one quite knew the origin of. He spent his gentle days dismantling clocks that were never broken and rebuilding them slightly askew, just enough to improve spontaneity, he explained. The villagers, of course, brought their timepieces to him with feigned seriousness, pretending to be indignant when he returned their mantel clocks set 15 minutes closer to peace of mind. "Now, you'll never be late for a nap," he'd smile. The postmaster, Mrs. Elsie Bramble, had once turned up flustered because the town hall bell had chimed thrice during her lunch hour, at 2:47, 2:55, and once just for fun. Edgar listened solemnly, took a bite of his biscuit, and mumbled, "A little unpredictability keeps people spry." Of course, nothing changed. Elsie adjusted her sandwiches. Strangely, perhaps enchantingly, despite Edgar's inventive unpunctuality, people in Upper Fromlinshire were, by consequence, quite content. Buses, by which I mean the single bus, did not adhere to schedules, but instead ran when Eustace the driver feels up to it. Meals began when the potatoes agreed to soften, and weddings only started once someone noticed the bride had arrived. There are cultures that build temples to gods of time. There are scholars who speak of years as epochs and calendars as chronicles of destiny. But here, the second hand took its sweet time, and no one ever scolded it for doing so. It is said that Edgar once claimed, softly and with marmalade on his chin, "Clocks are merely suggestions. The real time lives in weather." And when the rains came, as they often did, they meant it was time to listen, or to nap, or to knit Argyle regrets in your decision-making socks. As the drizzle thickens now and the wind coils itself gently around chimney pots, Edgar leans back in his creaky chair, sipping something floral and dubious, while Bertram the cuckoo hollers good-natured nonsense at the cat. And just through the puddled path, where the trees mutter secrets to anyone who'll listen, lives someone who makes maps of places no one wants to go. But that's another quiet story. Down at the far end of the village, right where the cobblestones grew shy and the moss grew bold, there was a crooked little shed that called itself a sock workshop. Not ambitious ones, mind you. These were socks of the vastly uninspired variety, beige, thick as oat porridge, and about as exciting as tax forms in February. Inside, one would often find Eustace Threadle, the village's only sock weaver, and possibly its most solemn citizen. Eustace had inherited his modest knitting establishment from his father, who inherited it from his great-aunt, who may or may not have invented the concept of grey on grey as an acceptable fashion palette. The family legacy was as cosy as it was drab, and Eustace wore it with the weary pride of someone who understood that excitement was for other villages. The loom, hand-carved in 1723 out of a sycamore that had grown in precisely the same spot for 5 consecutive centuries, creaked softly as Eustace worked. His socks were utilitarian, reliable, and subtly different from left to right. He called this asymmetry character. The villagers called it deeply unnecessary, though they continued to wear them with the grateful silence of people living within an impossibly dull climate. Rain whispered on the thatch as Eustace hummed a tune no one knew and fewer wanted to remember. The ballad of the modestly damp calf, perhaps, or Don't Let Your Ankles Catch a Chill, again. Now, what makes sock making a worthy chapter in our tale, you might wonder? Well, admittedly, it isn't. Entire generations of historians have neglected sock weaving in favour of wars, treaties, and scandalous liaisons involving powdered wigs. But the humble sock was a silent hero, especially in villages like this one, where wind crept like a gossip and fireplaces were more aspirational than functional. And Eustace, despite his gentle despair, was indeed a craftsman. His stitches were consistent to the point of philosophical inquiry. Monks have fasted for less than it took Eustace to finish a pair of mid-calf woolens. Once, a visiting merchant from the bustling port city of slightly busier upon sea tried to interest him in imported dyes. Eustace politely declined, explaining that colours tended to startle the feet. Of course, sock weaving has a noble lineage. In the 8th century, Egyptian toe socks, yes, toe socks, history can be cruel, were made from brightly dyed wool, and in medieval Europe, hand-knitted stockings signified status, mostly because only the comfortably idle had the hours to spare for knitwork and relevancy. In contrast, Eustace's socks signified only that someone had cold ankles and very few aesthetic ambitions. Sometimes, school children were brought on slow Thursdays for Sock History Hour, wherein Eustace would slowly demonstrate the difference between a pearl stitch and a philosophical crisis. While the children struggled to stay alert, Eustace would inevitably lapse into tales of how once, in the year of the slight moistening, 1748, a rare shipment of lavender yarn had arrived by accident. It was quickly buried beside the old sheep paddock to avoid hysteria. But even in tedium, there's a kind of peace. The shuffle of wool, the soft thunk of the loom, the rain's polyrhythmic tapping on the roof. These tiny rhythms cradled the village like a lullaby in minor key. Eustace never married, not for lack of offers, but because he once wrote a courtship poem that rhymed clavicle with practical and felt he could never top it. In his own way, he was a romantic, and so the sock workshop hummed on, quietly, stubbornly, relentlessly beige. Years passed like a slow snowfall, and still, Eustace knitted, with the unwavering commitment of a man who once tried excitement, found it to be overstimulating, and immediately poured himself a nice glass of room-temperature milk. And it was good. As the moon tiptoed through scattered clouds and the distant church bell bonged in A minor, accidentally of course, Eustace set down his needles and stretched his fingers with the solemn grace of someone who knew precisely how unremarkable his day had been. Outside, someone left a lone sock on the garden fence, perhaps as tribute, perhaps as laundry gone rogue. And somewhere down the lane, deeper into the drizzle and the dreams, a tiny flicker of candlelight danced behind the dark windows of the village's next secret. A rather sleepy one, at that. In the misty heart of late October, with rain whispering on thatched roofs like a shy house guest, uncertain whether to knock or vanish into the hedgerow, the village of Grumbleton carried on with all the quiet urgency of a turtle deciding whether or not to blink. Life in Grumbleton had rules, not the kind enforced by magistrates or posted on notice boards with stern lowercase English. No, these were older, wearier rules. Less written, more deeply muttered, through generations of villagers who communicated largely through narrowed eyes and the subtle angle of a raised eyebrow. One such rule, likely concocted by an ancestor who overcooked asparagus once, stated that umbrellas may only be opened at a 45-degree angle during polite conversation. This meant that on misty days, which is to say almost all days, street talk resembled a strangely choreographed ballet of watery deflections, as umbrellas tilted conspiratorially toward one another in passive-aggressive agreement. The Grumbleton Umbrella Convention of 1847 tried to standardize the angles to 43 degrees, citing over-tilt and subsequent leakage in cordial exchanges. But the village never accepted that radicalism again. Too modern, too dry. There was also a rule about teacups, always held in the right hand unless it was Tuesday or your aunt was visiting, in which case the left hand was permissible so long as your biscuit did not break during the dunking process. Dunking etiquette may appear to the outsider as madness wrapped in porcelain, but locals treated it with all the solemnity of a royal procession. A snapped biscuit mid-dunk was not just a culinary disaster, it was a social emergency. The last such incident in 1983 led to 4 hours of silent knitting before peace was quietly declared over a shared bun. One must understand, of course, that Grumbleton ran not on clocks or calendars, but on rhythms felt deep in the marrow. The sun, rarely seen, was neither punctual nor particularly ambitious in his daily performance, often peeking out at idiosyncratic angles, flattering only one chimney at a time before retreating bashfully behind the hill. Which brings us to Mrs. Eunice Piddlethorpe, 89 years old and the stern, starched guardian of Grumbleton's etiquette ledger, a heavy volume kept beneath her bed between a copy of A History of Rural Curdling and a perfectly preserved jam scone from 1961. Eunice considered herself less of a village busybody and more of a ceremonial watchdog, although with clotted cream in one hand and the ledger in the other, her bite was considerably less menacing than her occasional bark. Her role was bestowed 2 husbands ago, when she shushed the vicar's sneeze during evensong, and no one dared contest her social authority again. With her tiny spectacles and footstool thrown beside the parlour fire, she maintained vigilance over Grumbleton's behavioural standards. Children would speak in whispers while passing her cottage, which naturally delighted her. Dogs sat upright without needing to be told. Even the ravens rearranged their feathers in her presence with the air of small accountants preparing for audit. Eunice recorded infractions in the ledger using an ancient fountain pen, rumoured to leak disapproval. Page 539 alone contained 3 full entries on the correct pace of a sorrowful nod. This, dear listener, was Grumbleton, a place where the passage of time was measured not in events, but in murmurs and the gentle clink of teaspoons, where propriety was a kind of weather, and conversations took turns the way an ox cart might, slowly, predictably, and without raising dust. And while some may find such formality suffocating, those within it found something almost soothing in the structure. After all, in a world that seemed to change constantly, Grumbleton held firm. Tucked beneath its damp hills like a pair of woolen slippers nobody dared throw away. Indeed, the only real threat to village order arrived one Tuesday in the form of a new resident, recently retired from the Ministry of Button Classification. But that tale shall wait, for their arrival coincided with a foul dunking accident at precisely 3 o'clock, a time, according to Eunice's ledger, reserved strictly for non-committal glances and second cups of tea. So let the rain tap gently upon your window as the umbrellas of Grumbleton sink to their sacred angles. And hush now, for somewhere just beyond the hedgerow, an unfamiliar suitcase has just been placed on an all too familiar doorstep. If you can imagine a place where nothing ever happens, very, very slowly, then you may be picturing the village boundary of Nether Snoring, and more precisely, the scene of one of its most unenthusiastic quarrels, the Great Hedge Disagreement of 1812. Now, call it a great disagreement, and history might start looking suspiciously eager. But rest assured, this was a dispute so tepid, it could only have taken place in a hamlet where even the excitements of tea went unremarked upon. The word great here perhaps refers more to how long it dragged on, rather than the intensity of its drama. And drag it did. Over 2 years, 3 cucumber seasons, and the dull death of a goose who, in the end, just couldn't take it anymore. You see, the north edge of Farmer Pettigrew's property met the south edge of Widow Cuttle's. Between them ran a hedge, or rather, the ancient remains of a hedge. A sort of patchy, half-hearted scruff of hawthorn, which more resembled a stooped man in a green overcoat than a proud botanical boundary. According to Farmer Pettigrew, the hedge was precisely 17 inches into Widow Cuttle's land. He'd measured it 3 times, once with a string, once with his grandfather's bone-handled yardstick, and once simply by squinting and hoping for the best. Widow Cuttle, never one to be hurried, regarded Pettigrew's calculations with a raised eyebrow and her usual strategic delay. She replied 6 months later with a damp envelope, inside which was a note written in her late husband's ledger, in which she argued that, in fact, the hedge was 12 inches inside his land. Her argument rested not on string nor yardstick, but on the position of a molehill that had allegedly marked the true boundary since the Norman conquest, or fairly near to it. Now, both parties being quiet, stubborn, and beholden to century-old almanacs rather than modern logic, the matter fell into what Nether Snoring called a situation. The villagers, who had little else to speculate upon, having already discussed spring's disappointing rhubarb crop, formed opinions. The hedge problem, as it became whispered in the post office and mumbled in the apothecary's queue, became the only topic dull enough to unite the village in mild irritation. There were no protests, nor placards, of course. Nether Snoring didn't go in for that sort of thing. Instead, an unofficial committee was formed comprised of 2 members, Reverend Bumbleditch, whose hearing was too poor to follow either argument, and Miss Flossie Netting, the town's unofficial goose tickler, a job more ceremonial than practical. They met weekly in the vestry over weak stew, recording extensive minutes of increasingly irrelevant points such as the emotional impact of trimming hedges on Sundays and the suspicious absence of the clover beetles that year. As the months wore on, the hedge, a stoic presence throughout, began to reassert its independence. No longer the subject, but the silent victor. It leaned heavily towards Pettigrew's side for a few weeks, then slumped enigmatically towards Widow Cuttle's. It sprouted a solitary blackbird, who set up residence in an act of arboreal diplomacy, flitting between properties with no allegiance but to worms. At last, in a village meeting held on a Thursday so rainy it might as well have been underwater, the townspeople agreed, by raised eyebrows more than raised hands, that perhaps the dispute could be resolved by simply referring to the land as shared territory. The decision came during a moment of silence that had followed Miss Flossie's sneeze. Never underestimate how much history is shaped by the casual surprise of a sneeze. And so, the great hedge disagreement of 1812 ended not with a bang, nor even a polite cough, but with a tacit agreement not to discuss borders anymore. The hedge was left to grow, wobble absurdly in the wind, and shelter 6 field mice, at least one of whom had very strong opinions on disputed territories. As for the molehill that Widow Cuttle had pointed to, it crumbled quietly one summer morning, unburdened at last, returning to earth like so many forgotten arguments in the sleepy pastures of time, and with the hedge gently rustling in the drizzling twilight, our story floats onward, toward the odd, almost accidental invention of Nether Snoring's most confusing musical instrument, the drizzle horn. In the heart of a particularly unspectacular June, under a grey sky so consistently overcast that it felt like the clouds had signed a multi-decade tenancy agreement, the villagers of Nether Droning prepared for the high point of their town's social calendar, a spectacle so tame, so magnificently forgettable, that it could only be called the annual festival of utterly mild celebrations. Now, you might wonder, what exactly does one do at a festival of such subdued enthusiasm? Well, not much. But it was done with such tremendous earnestness, it would be churlish not to admire it. The festival dated, loosely and rather lazily, back to the late 1500s, when a local vicar named Reverend Eustace Bramble decided that the village needed something, anything really, to break up the tedium between lamb shearing season and the annual regrouping of the parish hall. According to council records, which no one had dusted off since the great damp paper incident of 1911, Reverend Bramble proposed the event as an occasion to mark the continuing existence of the village with modest acknowledgement. And so it was born, a tradition of careful celebration, not too much, just enough, like a lukewarm cup of tea on a mid-range afternoon. Each year, the festival began with the ceremonial rolling out of the longest sausage roll in Dorset. Though this record had never been measured nor contested, largely because no one else in the county had ever attempted to make a 12-foot roll of flaky pastry that was more air than sausage. The sausage was supplied by Mr. Pomeroy at the butcher's, whose family had also played the crucial role of providers of the small sausage element since the year 1643, when Cromwell, apparently unimpressed with Nether Droning's military contributions, left behind a pig instead of thanks. Once the pastry had been wheeled through the high street on a handcart cushioned with repurposed parish hymnals, it was sliced into 173 equally uninspiring portions and distributed to villagers by the Women's Guild of Measured Optimism. Following that excitement came the Great Spoon Relay, a sporting event so gentle it had once been described in the Dorset Times as a race only in the loosest sense of the word. In it, teams of villagers daintily walked from one mossy bench to another, balancing wooden spoons filled with, but not too full, a slightly gelatinous blob of loganberry jam. No one ever dropped the spoon. No one ever tried to win. The event concluded when the vicar declared, "That's probably enough," and everyone clapped politely for the slowest participant, as was tradition. Afternoons were reserved for competitive knitting, which, though entirely calm, was taken deeply, seriously by the more ambitious members of the over-70s Bobbin Society. One year, a particularly nimble-fingered Mrs. Hetherington had managed to stitch a 4-foot replica of the telegraph pole outside the pharmacy, purely from memory. A scandal erupted when someone suggested she had started the pole 6 months early. A formal investigation was opened, gently explored, and then quietly lost behind the minutes book of 1963. The evening was capped off with the famously cautious bonfire, built no taller than knee height, surrounded by a ring of damp stones, and overseen by 3 fire wardens with nothing flammable in their immediate ancestry. Around it, the villagers would gather with mugs of steaming weak bergamot tea and sing traditional local songs, such as Ode to Moderate Rainfall, and the ever-popular We Quite Like Our Fence as It Is. There were no fireworks, of course. Fireworks had been attempted once, in 1798. The tale, passed down with the hushed reverence of cautionary folklore, involved a single rocket, which startled a duck and cracked a single pane in the post office. That was deemed about as much excitement as the village could withstand in a century, and so, from that day forth, all celebratory noises were restricted to gentle gasps and the occasional accordion sigh. And yet, for all its mildness, its ceremonial sighing, its structured boredom, its devotion to the art of nearly doing something, the festival was adored. Children looked forward to it. Elders cherished it. It was a moment not of thrill, but of togetherness, a gentle lull in the already barely flowing stream of village life, where people remembered they liked each other, or at least tolerated each other in a fond, tea-drenched way. As the sky dimmed from light grey to dark grey, and raindrops began to whisper gently against the cobblestones, the last of the spoon relayers retired their spoons. Somewhere nearby, the loganberry jam was being stored once again in the village vault. next to last year's surplus bunting and a mysterious hat labelled property of Samuel Pepys. And just like that, another festival had passed, with hardly a ripple, which in nether droning was exactly how everyone liked it. In the morning, the bunting would be taken down, the leftover tea leaves would be composted ceremonially by Councillor Fenchurch, and thoughts would drift ever so slowly to what passed for anticipation in nether droning. A village vote on a new shade of beige for the library's back wall. But tonight, there was only the sound of light drizzle, the occasional snore of a contented sheep, and the soft rustle of knitting needles still clacking faintly beneath someone's fleece-lined shawl. Somewhere, in the still streets of the village, a door creaked open, and a curious letter arrived. But that is a detail for another soft and sleepy time. It was a damp little Tuesday in the village of Nether Slowly, when the council held its most electrifying meeting in 30 years. The agenda? You might wish it was a dragon sighting or a surprise gold mine uncovered beneath the bakery, but no, it was the procurement of a new rain gauge. Now, in any other place on Earth, a rain gauge is an unassuming cylinder designed to measure precipitation. Bit of plastic or copper plopped in a garden, unnoticed by all but the occasional distracted snail. But in Nether Slowly, the act of measuring rain was sacred business. For how else was one to determine whether the Tuesday drizzle was gloomier or merely sulkier than that of last Thursday's? The village's old rain gauge, a noble, moss-encrusted veteran of 1877, had developed a decidedly personal tilt, leaning to the left like a gossiping aunt, and only measuring what it pleased. So, they summoned an expert. This expert arrived one remarkably foggy morning, her boots covered in peat, and her name stitched onto a corduroy waistcoat. Mrs. Gwendolyn Prattle, Head of Precipitation Accuracy at the Royal Bureau of Rural Moisture. Mrs. Prattle was a marvel, with cheeks like boiled new potatoes and spectacles that made her eyes appear permanently awestruck. She surveyed Nether Slowly's hydrometric dilemma with all the gravity of a woman inspecting the crown jewels through a drizzle. She clutched a small black notebook and never blinked. Not once. It was said, only half in jest, that she could stare down a thunderstorm until it considered apologizing. Children waved at her from behind hedges. She did not wave back. After measuring the lean of the old gauge, consulting the Bureau's humidity ledger, and tapping 3 times on a barometer, Mrs. Prattle determined that a new gauge must be set up on level ground, precisely 27.3 feet from the nearest livestock, and no closer than a hop and a half, official unit, from any rhubarb plant. The rhubarb clause seemed oddly specific, until you know that rhubarb has, on no fewer than 5 occasions, distorted rainfall data across British villages due to its impudent leaves leaning in and out of gauges like nosy pub patrons. The villagers gathered near the cricket pitch the following day, where Sergeant Peebles, still in uniform despite formal retirement in 1989, was tasked with setting up the new gauge. It was made of glass and copper, delightfully Victorian in spirit. A boxy affair with a viewing hatch, it looked not unlike a polite robot that might offer you tea in a fog. Then came the pouring, softly, ticklishly, like a cat pawing at the windows of the heavens. And as the first drops met the gauge, Mrs. Prattle announced, "We are entering measurable precipitation." The crowd murmured their approval. She scrawled it in her book, 3 millimeters and rising. "Oh," whispered Mrs. Pevensey, her shawl blossoming outward in the wind like a philosophical moth. Children danced, elderly men hummed. One woman, we suspect Greta Mullings, burst into tears, overcome by the sheer precision of it all. And yet, not everyone approved. Old Bertie Muggs, the village's unofficial grumbling authority, muttered something about, "Back in my day we felt the rain. We didn't measure it." But Bertie had disagreed with most things since 1943, including the invention of teaspoons. As the rain fell straighter, kinder, and more mathematically, the village began to feel a profound sense of clarity. They were, for the first time in recorded boredom, able to log their rainfall with near Galilean confidence. There was even talk of printing a monthly moisture bulletin, but Mrs. Prattle advised caution. "With great drizzle comes great detail," she warned, not unkindly. When the storm had passed, if one could call it that, barely a pout of precipitation, the villagers stood in awe before their new glass sentinel, as if it had delivered unto them a miracle of civility. Mrs. Prattle blinked for the first time. Once. Then she turned, packed her notebook, and walked into the vanishing fog, her waistcoat slowly disappearing into the mist like a damp, bureaucratic Excalibur. The village never saw her again, though a postcard with nothing but the words 4.2 millimeters, respectfully yours, arrived the following spring. As night fell that day, the gauge glimmered under the dim street lamp, a quiet witness to droplets yet to come. And somewhere across the square, the ancient weather vane, shaped like a startled chicken, turned ever so slightly to the west, signaling the approach of something far more thrilling than rain. The annual debate on where the sun truly sets in Nether Slowly. Now, if I told you that the most explosive political standoff ever to hit the village of Eldershire-le-Plain involved a picket fence and a disagreement over ornamental shrubbery spacing, would that quicken your pulse? No? Excellent. That's precisely the right mood for this chapter. Let us stroll sleepily now into Eldershire's parish records from the year 1747. A truly thrilling year in which precisely nothing exciting happened, except a prolonged disagreement between two neighbours named Ethel Withers and Reverend Colin Prim. But oh, what a disagreement it was. It began, as all great sagas do, with a goose and a misunderstanding. Ethel, a widow of robust opinion and precise knitting, claimed the Reverend's goose, Harold, had trampled her dahlias. Reverend Prim countered that dahlias were, and I quote, "a most conceited flower," implying that perhaps their demise was a mercy. This didn't go over well. What followed was not a brawl. Eldershire had too much rain and too few tempers for anything approaching violence. No, what followed was a fifth committee on boundary ethics, summoned under the great umbrella of mutual sogginess, chaired by the omnipresent Mrs. Dabble, who at the time also served as librarian, postmaster, midwife, and lead soprano of the one-woman village choir. Mrs. Dabble, bless her slow blinks and penchant for monosyllabic pronouncements, famously declared the fence issue to be sufficiently squabbly to warrant full community arbitration. In a move that shocked precisely no one, the villagers took 3 weeks debating whether the fence should be oak, elm, or the far more exotic possibility, painted pine. The excitement was so mild, it made a passing badger yawn. But the great fence debate, as it came to be known in no textbooks whatsoever, revealed something curious about Eldershire's soul. You see, while the rest of England occasionally dabbled in revolutions, enlightenment, and the occasional outbreak of plagues, the villagers of this timid little parish believed deeply that nothing good ever came from quick decisions. It was a place where people stirred tea so long that the sugar gave up trying to dissolve. Reverend Prim, contrary to his goose's aggressive waddling habits, was a man of contemplative slowness. It's said his sermons had the same effect as warm milk on a full stomach, soothing, gently forgettable, and impossible to finish awake. Ethel Withers, meanwhile, took to writing handcrafted passive-aggressive notes in cursive, so curlicued they occasionally looped back in time. Eventually, of course, the fence was built, half elm, half painted pine, with a ceremonial goose caution sign delicately watercoloured by the vicar's niece. Relations were restored when Ethel presented Reverend Prim with a lukewarm plum tart and a truce bouquet made mostly of weeds, which she declared honestly more fragrant than those ridiculous dahlias. Harold, in turn, refused to acknowledge any of it, being a goose, and therefore contractually obligated to be indifferent. But beyond the picket matters of fences and flowers, it helps to remember that in this particular village, governance was exercised with the same energy one might apply to pre-warming a teapot. Gentle, meandering, and fundamentally reliant on someone eventually remembering to do it. There was, by the way, a mayor. Sort of. Mayor Silas Butterkelp, a man whose most sweeping policy reform involved instituting a mandatory 2-biscuit minimum at every public meeting, lest things grow too austere. Under his guidance, the bureaucracy of Eldershire reached legendary levels of mild inconvenience. Want to build a tool shed? You'll need Form 9B slippers, an oil lamp, and 3 signatures from unrelated residents who each once owned a duck. And yet, despite the mind-numbing placidity of municipal life, or perhaps because of it, Eldershire's citizens basked in the warmth of mutual toleration. Why argue when you could sit in a drizzle and judge people silently? That was the motto, roughly translated, engraved on the back of the town spoon. So when the world beyond their hills rumbled with invention, war, and monumental decisions, the villagers of Eldershire preferred quieter crises, whether the tea cosy should be embroidered with holly or heather, or if a weather vane shaped like a hedgehog might offend the Methodists. It was a sleepy sort of harmony, one brewed slowly over centuries, where boredom itself was a community treasure, dusted off, admired, and politely debated by candlelight. Even disagreements, such as they were, unfolded like extended lullabies, repetitive, circular, and best handled on days too rainy to garden. And as the mist curled once more along the cobbled lanes, and Harold the goose muttered his nightly complaints to nobody in particular, you could rest assured Eldershire was exactly as it had always been, splendidly uneventful. Now, don't drift too far just yet. There's a rather unremarkable statue in the square waiting to tell its story next. By the time the morning drizzle had shifted from a determined tap to a mere sulky mist, the village of Nether Snoring, globally recognized by absolutely no one as the most boring village in the world, was already well into the drowsier half of its day. A village that once tried to schedule tea o'clock twice daily to boost excitement, then revoked it for being too eventful. Today, we lean our heads gently against the soft cotton curtain of history and peer back several centuries to a Thursday, never a Monday far too abrupt, in the year of our imaginary Lord, 1732, when the Teacup Rebellion occurred, or rather, almost occurred, and then absolutely didn't, and then, to be safe, was recorded in exactly 0 newspapers out of concern it might raise pulses unnecessarily. It began, as many mild insurrections do, with a saucer. Mrs. Eunice Plod, head of the Nether Snoring Porcelain Accountability Society, had taken issue with Mr. Balfrey Humbridge's choice of mug at the weekly Whispering Luncheon, a potluck where louder chewing than necessary was quietly discouraged. Mr. Humbridge, recently returned from a holiday to Ipswich, recovery pending, unveiled a teacup of suspiciously foreign design. That, intoned Eunice with the authoritative softness of someone who alphabetizes her herbs weekly, is not regulation snoring ware. Indeed, it wasn't. The cup was round, too round, with a decorative edge too saucy for local standards. It featured a bird, painted, in flight. The sheer kinetic energy implied was nearly scandalous. In nether snoring, birds were strictly to be depicted perching, or snoozing. The matter might have ended there, simmering peacefully under the gingham-topped lid of social restraint, had Mr. Humbridge not then followed it up by sipping his tea and wait for it, before blowing on it 3 times, in the traditional snoring fashion. Gasps, silent of course. Now, should you find yourself thinking that a full-scale rebellion might be a bit of an overreaction to a hot beverage and a bird in motion, you may not be a true nether snorinite. For in this village, boredom wasn't just valued, it was sacred. The introduction of an unpredictable teacup risked spirals of spontaneity. Spontaneity, they feared, could lead to dancing, and dancing could lead to a 3rd lane in the high street. Madness. And so it was that the teacup rebellion was drafted. There were quiet meetings, subtle murmurs in the bakehouse, and coded messages delivered via slight variations in scone shape. One rebellious bun, heartbreakingly raisinless, was seized before any damage could be done. The climax came, or rather, gently approached, on a fine and beige Sunday. A crowd gathered solemnly outside the community hall, armed with pamphlets of delicately worded disapproval. Mr. Humbridge stood on the single step outside the hall, a step technically designated as neither up nor down per village compromise, and held his teacup aloft. The bird, mid-flight, looked almost smug, and then it began to rain, not impressively, but insistently. More rain meant more damp, and more damp meant mildew. So naturally, the villagers agreed to call it off. The rebellion never officially happened. A tea truce was signed. Mr. Humbridge agreed to keep the cup for special non-public occasions, and a resolution of socially acceptable crockery was drafted, including a 4-page appendix on appropriate levels of glaze reflectivity. Of course, none of this was ever recorded in any official history book, not because it wasn't important, but because no one could stay fully awake long enough to write it down. Still, to this day, if you visit the Nether Snoring Local Museum of Slight Misfortunes, there's an oddly shaped scone behind glass and a porcelain cup with a faint mural of a bird that appears to be thinking about flight, but not quite committing. And should you open the guestbook there, in the section titled Rebellions Large or Otherwise, you'll find a solitary entry. Rebellion nearly began. Weather impractical. Tea lukewarm. Everyone fine. As the mists gather once more over the thatched rooftops and the wind tickles the hedgerows with sleepy fingers, we drift onward, toward the next legend of soft conflict and damp revolution. It had been raining absolutely steadily, like a faucet set on medieval drizzle, for the better part of 3 weeks in the village of Nether Wimble-on-the-Wold. The puddles had developed personalities, the clouds had tenancy agreements, and the villagers, beneath their perpetually damp bonnets and cloaks, had adjusted their sense of time not by clock or calendar, but by how soggy their biscuits felt at tea. In this damp serenity stood something of profound local importance and worldwide irrelevance: the teacup tree. Now, to the wandering eye, should such eyes ever wander as far as Nether Wimble, the teacup tree might appear to be an ordinary, quite tired-looking elder tree, adorned with mismatched ceramic cups. There were floral teacups, chipped saucers, and even one commemorative Queen Victoria mug wedged between the upper branches, possibly hurled there during an enthusiastic fete in 1892. No one could quite recall how the tradition began, but for reasons as forgotten as last Thursday's potatoes, it became the silent agreement of the village that each year, on the 15th day of April, or whenever Geoffrey the milkman remembered, it was time to hang a new teacup. No fanfare, no trumpets, just a single new cup, subtly balanced on a limb, while the rest of the village nodded approvingly, then promptly forgot it happened. But 1 year, oh yes, dear listener, brace yourself gently. A notion of mild excitement wafted into the village square like a drowsy breeze. Outsiders had heard of the teacup tree, specifically a recently formed society of historical reenactors with rather questionable free time who called themselves the Order of the Obscure Twig. Their mission: to theatrically reclaim lost relics of forgotten history and then talk about them on niche radio stations at 2 a.m. They declared, with complete sincerity and matching cloaks, that the teacup tree was once the ceremonial site of a secret medieval order of contemplative monks known as the Brood Brotherhood, who allegedly meditated with china in hand to achieve transcendental steep. This was, of course, pure nonsense. Professor Tottlethwaite from the county archive confirmed after 7 cups of nettle tea and a bit of sneezing that there had never been any brotherhood, transcendence, or steeping, just a rather persistent squirrel that once stashed a sugar cube in a gravy boat, wedged in the roots. Nevertheless, the Order of the Obscure Twig announced their plans to besiege the teacup tree in a symbolic ceremony they dubbed Operation Cuppa. They would arrive in full faux medieval regalia, capes, flagons, and perhaps a lute. Now, the villagers of Netherwimble viewed this announcement with their characteristic brand of deeply passive tolerance. They neither objected nor agreed. They simply whispered, "Oh," and went on with their knitting, marmalade boiling, or constructing eerily accurate scale models of daffodils in spoon rests. So the siege began. It was a siege in only the most abstract sense. The order marched soggily into town, dramatically stood in a circle around the venerable tree, and hummed a Gregorian chant so out of tune it frightened several ducks into early migration. They attempted to claim the tree by tapping it gently with a ladle. Eunice Butterbar, who had been watching from her window while frosting digestive biscuits, opened the sash just enough to ask, "Would you like a nice sit-down and a crumpet?" The would-be invaders capitulated within the hour. As recompense for their costly and brief campaign, the villagers offered the group a commemorative cup to hang, procured from the back shelf of the pub, formerly used to hold loose coins, and occasionally, mysteriously, a geranium petal. The members of the Order of the Obscure Twig thanked them solemnly and posed beside the tree, arms awkwardly linked, for a fuzzy photograph, which later appeared in a magazine that had a circulation of 4. And so, the teacup tree remained quietly unbesieged, its newest cup swinging gently in the breeze like a fragile bell of good humor. It never was stolen nor studied, but sometimes, on especially grey mornings, it tinkled softly in tune with the wind, as if murmuring an old porcelain lullaby to anyone dozy enough to listen. In the end, the villagers found the entire siege to be gently amusing, if mildly damp. As Harold Peatwhistle put it later in the pub, "It was the most exciting thing that's happened since we ran out of anchovy paste in 76, but less troubling." And with that hanging cup and the echo of distant chants, the village drifted once more into its long, low hum of not very much, completely content with its claim to inconsequence. Now, speaking of inconsequential icons, there was an old bridge at the far edge of the village. No one crossed it. No one quite trusted it. And yet, oddly enough, it had a name known to nearly everybody: the Bridge of Almost. As the rain performed its nightly tap dance on the mossy thatch roofs of Lower Nether Bumble, the villagers closed their shutters, lit their teeniest oil lamps, and tucked themselves into beds that creaked like old accordion players. The year was 1762, though in Lower Nether Bumble, time moved so slowly that the calendar often forgot what century it was altogether. Now, while the rest of the world was preoccupied with revolutions and enlightenment, the proud folk of Lower Nether Bumble were utterly absorbed in a matter of considerably greater importance: spoons. Not forks. That would be madness. Not knives. Those were only allowed to be used under supervision by the village constable, and only on Tuesdays. No spoons, those curved ambassadors of soup and pudding, were at the very centre of the single most riveting civic kerfuffle Lower Nether Bumble had faced since the turnip count discrepancy of 43. It all began, quite naturally, with porridge. Mrs. Winifred Peebles, known locally as Winnie the Stir, had raised a concern at the Tuesday Committee for Overly Specific Concerns, a thriving segment of local government. She had declared, while lifting a rather lukewarm spoonful of oat paste, "The curvature of spoons has become an outrage." You see, for years the village's spoons had been crafted by one family, the Whittle spoons, famous for a particular bend in the neck that made them perfect for scooping cold stews and moral ambiguity. But in 1761, Mr. Aloysius Whittlespoon took it upon himself to experiment. "My new design," he proclaimed, "shall change the way we slurp." And thus, spoons with, brace yourselves, a slight twist to the handle were introduced. This, dear listener, sent shockwaves through the porridge-eating population of Lower Nether Bumble. The reaction was instant. Outrage simmered like unattended broth. The Shani Spoon Council, yes, a real thing, complete with robes, ridiculous titles, and a hand-carved badge, called an emergency session. Minutes from the meeting record one Madam Thistle Trunchcake declaring, "We will not have avant-garde cutlery in this parish. What's next? A spork?" Others were more measured. Benedict Fluff, the village's most moderate voice, an unofficial sage of spoons, argued gently, "A twisty handle may aid those with wrist afflictions acquired from excessive journaling." A compelling point, especially in a village where the weather caused elbows to rust by 45. The debate raged over several harvest cycles. Tables were divided, porridge cooled, and allegiances formed, Team Bend and Team Straight, each with a flag, a song, and a disturbingly detailed pamphlet. Now, you may be wondering whether this impacted the broader world. It did not, but it felt terribly important in Lower Nether Bumble. And that is all that mattered on those drizzle-soaked evenings when villagers sat by flickering lantern light, discussing spoon ergonomics with the same solemnity other regions reserved for treaties and plagues. Eventually, it came to a vote, as all great British dramas must. The ballot options were simple. 1. Preserve traditional utensils. 2. Embrace spoon progressiveness. 3. Abstain because of existential uncertainty. The turnout was impressive. Nearly 17 villagers cast their votes using tiny stubs of pencil and fragments of mildewed parchment. As always, Albert Tudge voted twice, once for each of his personalities, but no one minded. His alter ego was generally more rational. The final tally, a dramatic tie, 8 for tradition, 8 for progress, and one vote that simply read, "I like forks." The village was stunned. The council adjourned in silence, a hush so deep even the mice began whispering. Then, from the back of the hall, came the frail voice of Edith Pennywhistle, age 94, who had not spoken for 17 years, not out of protest, but simply because she preferred to conserve her syllables. She cleared her throat. Then she simply said, "Why not both?" Gasps echoed. A sheep fainted. Someone dropped a jelly. Thus was born the compromise spoon, known ever after as Edith's Choice, a tool with just enough bend to please the progressive porridge enthusiasts, and just enough tradition to avoid scandal. It was a masterpiece of deeply average design. Peace returned, spooning resumed, and to this day, a rusting plaque in the tea hall commemorates the legendary spoon debate with a quote that reads, "Let us stir in harmony, whether curved or straight or slightly perplexed." Outside, the rain eased to a drizzle like a polite curtain call. Inside, knees were warmed, teacups were rinsed, and somewhere a sleepy black cat curled on a windowsill beside an unfinished crossword. And just as the last cloud smudged the moonlight with drowsy dreams, the wind carried whispers of the forthcoming great umbrella misunderstanding. But that's a tale fit for a quieter tomorrow. By mid-afternoon, in the village of Nether Drumble, where clouds hung low like sheep too shy to bar, the rain had perfected its drizzle, and the moss on the stones had taken on a kind of smugness. The village, though tiny, was filled with great traditions, most of them completely uneventful. And yet, none stirred less excitement and curiously more devotion than fence watching. Now, let us not confuse fence watching with the rebellious outdoor sport of hedge leaning, or the scandalous 1842 incident when someone reportedly gazed at a gate. No, fence watching was an entirely static, extremely upright pastime unique to Nether Drumble. Practitioners took their positions near the village's various wooden enclosures and, well, watched. No talking, no touching, certainly no fixing. That would be tampering with the narrative. Every Tuesday after luncheon, at precisely 2 minutes past 2, a small group of self-designated fence loyalists would assemble near the east paddock, where 4 fence posts had been installed in the year 1709 and hadn't much moved since. Each post had a nickname, because naturally. Post 1, Sir Woodyard, the slightly tilted. Post 2, Madame Splinterington. Post 3, a post no one liked to talk about, rumoured to have once squeaked during a thunderstorm. And Post 4, Douglas. Each was revered for its distinct qualities. Sir Woodyard, for example, leaned just barely to the left, causing many to write poems about the noble struggle of carrying on despite life's gravitational tug. Madame Splinterington was admired for her textured empathy, rough to the touch, but enduring through centuries of drizzle. And Douglas, well, Douglas was just Douglas, reliable, not flashy. The Capricorn of the fence world. The fence watchers brought thermoses of weak tea, tin folding chairs, and an intense belief in the spiritual nourishment of observing stillness. The practice began allegedly in 1781, when local philosopher Edith Chundlebury stared at a fence for 40 minutes while waiting for her missing bonnet to come back with the wind. But instead of retrieving headwear, she came back with a manifesto in defense of fence peering. In it, she described the sensation as a highly stationary enlightenment that tickles the soul with monotony. So popular became Edith's treatise that a weekly column in the parish newspaper, the Drumble Droner, was devoted to the latest fence news, which included riveting headlines like "Post 2 holding steady, no bark loss this week," rain suspected of slight dampening. We heard a snail unsure which fence it likes. In 1856, an anonymous villager proposed setting up bunting for the fences, but this was rejected as dangerously festive. An emergency meeting was held, and the bunting was reallocated to the compost festival, where it could be more appropriately ignored. On rare occasions, a bird would land nearby. This was considered wildly inappropriate. It distracted the watchers and gave the fence more drama than strictly necessary. One robin, known to perch briefly upon Douglas in the 1990s, triggered a minor schism among watchers. Half felt Douglas had become arrogant, while the other half insisted the bird might have been a dream. Such was the theological depth of fence contemplation. You may wonder, dear listener, reclining beneath your duvet and drifting further from the world of emails and edge-of-screen notifications. What exactly did they see? Well, the truth may be nestled not in what was seen, but in what wasn't. The fences never changed, and that was their beauty. In a world spinning ever more frantically, where cities clamoured, trousers shortened, and marmalade flavours evolved, the people of Nether Drumble could rely on the fence, unflinching, unwavering, uninterested in spectacle. A reminder that sometimes it is enough to simply stand and let others watch. And so, as the afternoon faded softly back into evening's watery hush, the fence watchers began to slowly collect their chairs, murmuring polite remarks about consistent wood grain and moss of fine character. Douglas, of course, remained, a quiet sentinel of stodgy eternity. Lamp wicks were trimmed, kettles murmured on the Aga, and somewhere, just behind the village pond where ducks held their union meetings, a visitor had arrived with a mysterious object under one arm and an eyebrow raised in calculative curiosity. But that is a different chapter. Along the eastern edge of lower Nether Drowsing, where the mist lingers like an old librarian who's forgotten what she came in for, there lies a hedge, or rather, what appears to be a hedge, but is, in fact, the result of centuries of deeply methodical, tediously recorded village fence maintenance. Now, before you drift off with excitement, know this. Fence maintenance in lower Nether Drowsing is no ordinary pastime. Oh no. Here, it's considered both a civic duty and a competitive sport by locals who are constitutionally unsuited for both sports and duties. It all began in the year 1386, when the original boundary fence was established, not because of conflict or livestock, but because the village council believed lines bring a certain visual comfort. The first fence was made of willow twigs, soaked in good intentions and bound together with string, complaining quietly about its workload. But the real breakthrough in fence history came in 1722, with the invention of what villagers still proudly call the Great Peg System. This innovation, introduced by Master Clemethy Grunkle, involved colour-coded wooden pegs, each labelled with the date of its last inspection, the name of the inspector, and, most thrillingly, how damp it was on that particular Tuesday. This made fence maintenance more data-heavy, and thus infinitely more fulfilling to people who greatly enjoy charts. Each spring, the fence walk ceremony took place. A procession of sleepy-eyed villagers would shuffle the perimeter, gently poking each post with a specially carved stick, known locally as a pokey, and yelling, "Sound or soggy," which is a call and response method to test for rot or general existential malaise in the timber. Now, while the ceremony might sound ceremonious, it was meticulously uneventful. There were no floats, no music, and certainly no excitement. The most dramatic year on record was 1834, when the pokey stick was dropped into a mud patch and had to be temporarily retrieved, using someone's very reluctant spaniel. Over the centuries, fence maintenance became an expression of local pride, passing from one enthusiastic caretaker to the next. Families would hand down their pokies with solemn ceremony, along with dusty leather-bound fence logs full of riveting entries like March 3rd, 1809. Post 7 appears to lean slightly toward west, decision pending, and April 19th, 1892. Post 10 smelled faintly of apricot, note, unconfirmed. Remarkably, this manner of slow, contemplative care for wood and wire caught the attention of certain niche academics in the 1960s. A small group of ethnographic researchers from the University of Unfathomably Narrow Interests camped out in Lower Nether Drowsing for 3 consecutive Aprils, taking detailed notes on villagers' fencing rituals and trying not to look too interested, as that would have been considered disruptive. According to Professor Mildred Ponsworthy's landmark paper, Post by Post, Temporal Alignment Within Rural English Fence Behaviour, the act of maintaining a boundary in such a slow, deliberate way allowed the villagers to exist in what she termed permanent temporal drizzle, where time itself drips gently by, like lukewarm tea escaping the corner of a cracked mug. Of course, the villagers were never quite sure what Professor Ponsworthy meant by all this, especially as she insisted on attending fence inspections in a ceremonial robe and once offered a speech in Old Icelandic. But they agreed her handwriting was lovely and her sketches of fence posts surprisingly emotive. These days, less fencing is needed since most sheep have developed an inherent sense of ennui and no longer bother straying. But traditions die slowly here, if at all. And each month, the current keeper of the pokey, Mr. Harold Plimble, age 87 and shaped rather like a dowel, scuttles out to tap gently upon each marker. If someone stops to ask him why, Harold simply replies, "One never knows when a post might wobble," and continues on his rounds with the serene intensity of a monk conducting rainwater audits. And so the fence remains, patient, pointed, and profoundly boring. A living reminder that even in the lulling rhythm of nothing happening, there is greatness, or at least stable woodwork. As the moon rises over the spongy fields and the owls begin their half-hearted twit-toos, the village settles once more under the gentle spell of its own unyielding routine. And just past the final curve in the boundary, where the fence gives way to a small grove of snoring birches, something unusual stirs, nothing dramatic, of course. Just the whisper of a story involving 2 hedgehogs, a misplaced tax ledger, and a wheelbarrow with a secret. But we'll get to that soon enough. Among the drizzle-slicked cobblestones of the most boring village in the world, a sleepy place where the rain often came in polite intervals and the birds apologized before chirping, stood a narrow stone building with one crooked chimney and a fondness for damp envelopes. This, dear listener, was the local post office. Though busy would be the wrong word, and even functional might be a stretch, the post office was handled single-handedly by one Alabaster Fenn, the village's only postmaster, philosopher, amateur glue taster, and co-founder of the now-defunct Society for the Ethical Treatment of Mailboxes. Alabaster lived in the back of the post office, having once tried to live in the filing cabinet before the village council gently advised against it, using a sternly worded limerick. His days were predictable, unhurried, and wrapped in a gentle fog, scented faintly with damp stamps and the dreams of undelivered packages. Now, you might wonder, how much mail could possibly traverse the sleepy mist of this most uninspired village? The answer is somewhere between very little and less than most igloos receive. This reality never perturbed Alabaster. Quite the opposite. He found solace in slowness, poetry in paper cuts, and deep meditative insight while sorting identical blank postcards. What truly set Alabaster apart, however, wasn't his capacity to sort mail that rarely needed sorting. No, it was his peculiar tradition of writing letters that would never be sent. Each evening, after steeping his tea in precisely 17 clockwise stirs, he took to writing correspondence to long-gone philosophers, obscure vegetables, and in one notable case, the concept of Tuesday. "Dear Socrates," he began once, in his usual looping scrawl. "Today I accidentally mailed a letter to myself. Upon receiving it, I was deeply moved. Do you think all true wisdom is self-addressed? These letters, hundreds of them, line the unused pigeonholes of the post office like literary nesting birds. He once penned a passionate diatribe to a particularly unremarkable potato he'd met in the weekly bartering market. To Sir Tuber Whipplethorpe, it read, "Though your appearance was knobbly and your aroma faintly reminiscent of antique laundry, I found in you a quiet dignity that no boiled yam could ever achieve." The potato in question was later mashed for the harvest festival, but remembered in spirit. Alabaster's ritual became a topic of gentle curiosity in the village, though no one dared ask too many questions, as most found conversation with him to be like walking through a cloud made of crossword clues. Children sometimes peered through the foggy window panes to watch him mutter Latin phrases under his breath, while addressing an envelope to the concept of mild disappointment, see, "Oh, the universe." Their parents would murmur, "That's just Alabaster," in the same tone one uses to explain rain to a dog. Historically, and we always enjoy a good peek into history, especially when it's wearing a cardigan. There were, in fact, several rural postmasters like Alabaster Fenn in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In remote towns from Northumberland to New South Wales, they found ways to occupy long hours with no mail. Some turned to whittling, others to journaling, and a few, like the well-documented Isaac Twombly of Vermont, conducted elaborate imaginary correspondences with the Roman Senate. Postal solitude, it seems, gently eroded the boundary between service and self-reflection. A well-positioned pigeon may have been privy to some of the century's most quietly profound musings stamped and never sent. But unlike the others lost to history, Alabaster endured, undeterred by damp socks, unclaimed parcels, or the existential mystery of the "Do Not Bend" label. He found immense joy in the act of communication itself, whether or not anyone on the other end awaited a reply. Once a month, the bell of the post office chimed as if startled, announcing a rare occasion, outgoing mail, but it was always the same. A letter carefully placed in the outgoing tray, addressed only to whom it may one day matter. And perhaps that was Alabaster's quiet manifesto, that among the comically uneventful comings and goings of the village, there existed someone who believed even the most boring life could hold sprawling thoughts, waiting patiently in stamp-sized silence. The chimney puffed a little sigh of smoke as night pulled its cloudy shawl over the rooftops. Inside, Alabaster placed his latest unsent letter, one addressed to the moon's left eyebrow, gently into a drawer lined with lavender sachets and two surprisingly philosophical paper clips. And just as he began boiling his late-night tea, which, to no one's surprise, was chamomile with a hint of contemplative thyme, something unexpected arrived from the village square. Not a letter, not a package, but a story that arrived on muddied boots, with a crooked smile and a secret. and we'll open that envelope next. As the rain whispered steadily on the rooftops of Lower East Waddle on the Wold, a village so comfortable in its own boringness that even the puddles refused to ripple, there existed one institution more stalwart, more committed, and somehow even more wobbly than any council in the land, the Bucket Committee. Now, it must be said, very gently, like one would say to a pastry not to collapse, that the Bucket Committee was, in theory, responsible for ensuring the proper placement, upkeep, and quarterly polishing of every wooden bucket within village limits. The logic? Nobody remembers. The original parchment outlining their purpose was chewed by a goat in 1722, but the tradition stuck, as tradition tends to do, especially in places where the most exciting annual event is the meditative yawn contest. Every Tuesday, precisely at the hour when the church bell would not ring because the bell ringer invariably forgot, the Bucket Committee convened. They met in the dim back room of Mrs. Featherwick's tea house, between the stacked saucers and that portrait of her great-uncle Percy, who once claimed to have seen a cloud shaped like the Archbishop of Canterbury. There were 5 committee members, each more singularly underqualified than the last. There was Mr. Gramble, who had never owned a bucket, but insisted he understood their emotional fragility. Miss Tibble, who had fallen into a bucket as a child and insisted on speaking about it once every 6 minutes. Reverend Pusely, who believed buckets were divine metaphors and once attempted a sermon in the shape of one. Lady Margledoon, who knitted bucket cozies and threatened anyone who used a plastic pail. And finally, young Timothy Nodge, who accidentally wandered into the first meeting 6 years ago, sat down, and was too polite to leave. Each week, the committee faced what they referred to with trembling gravity as the weekly situation. This week, a disaster of grand insignificance had unfolded. Bucket number 14, a modest oaken fellow who resided beside the library and often held spare cabbages or confused hedgehogs, had tilted slightly to the left by precisely 1.37 degrees. Panic, in the form of furrowed brows and moist biscuits, gripped the room. Miss Tibble gasped in a full sentence. "Perhaps it's the earth that's tilting," offered Timothy, his voice the tentative tone of youth, grappling with middle-aged absurdity. "Nonsense," said Lady Margledoon, shielding her knitting with a protective gesture. "The earth knows better than to misalign itself in Waddle on the Wold." Reverend Pusely closed his eyes and murmured about spiritual imbalance before misquoting Galileo. Mr. Gramble produced a ruler and stared at it with such intensity, one might have thought he intended to measure the soul of the bucket. Through all this, the rain outside performed its nightly lullaby with rhythmic professionalism. No rush, no thunder, no drama. Just an old sky exhaling upon an even older village. "Well," said Mrs. Featherwick, entering with her famed thistle buns, like scones, but with the texture of an apologetic barn owl. Perhaps the wind gave it a nudge. A hush fell. The very idea struck them as dangerously modern. Wind. Nudging things. Where would it end? After an exhaustive debate, which included a 22-minute detour into the politics of medieval bucket handles, the committee voted 3 in favour, 1 against, 1 abstention due to unexpected nap, to reposition bucket number 14 using the ancient ceremonial poking stick. The poking stick was, of course, a relic believed to have been carved in 1644 from the leg of a particularly stubborn chair. It bore the inscription, "Thou shalt not jab in hastiness," and was kept wrapped in oiled linen, rewrapped in mystery, and stored in a place nobody quite remembered. Once it was found, behind the vicar's jam cupboard naturally. It was paraded through the square with absolutely no witnesses, and Bucket 14 was gently persuaded back into uprightness with a solemn thonk. Disaster averted. The committee adjourned, proud yet somehow doubly aware that they'd forgotten to notice the other 42 buckets entirely. But no matter. In Waddle on the Wold, the joy wasn't in the outcomes. It was in the ceremonial fiddling, the slow rearrangements, and the idea that a bucket tipped 1.37 degrees left could bring people together in comforting panic. Outside, the lamplighters made their way down the cobbled lanes, casting long, sleepy shadows. The wind was still up to its gentle, unseen antics. A cat named Crumpet softly sneezed behind the blacksmith's bench, and far across the glimmering lawn of the village proper, a strange clang echoed from the direction of the gravedigger's shed. But that, dear listener, is a quieter kind of mystery saved for soft-footed shadows and the next starlit chapter. On this particularly unremarkable Wednesday in the village of Nether Snoosley, the hour being somewhere between tea time and regret, it began to drizzle again. Showers of the soft, sideways kind tickled the cobblestones, and the ducks that loitered near the post office nodded approvingly. They were, as usual, unimpressed, as were most in Nether Snoosley. Now, tucked behind the hedgerows of Lupin Lane, a road so little used that moss had taken up permanent residence, stood the time-worn cottage of Mildred Thimblewhisk. Though not remembered by most history books, encyclopedias, or frankly anyone outside the parish knitting circle, Mildred had once sparked a revolution so quiet it never woke anyone up. You see, Mildred was the inventor of quiet time. Not quiet time with a capital Q and T, as enforced by nursery teachers, but rather quiet time in the philosophical, civic, and mildly sleepy sense. In the early 1800s, while the rest of Europe was busy revolting, conquering, or composing romantic symphonies filled with brass, Mildred launched what she called a movement of stillness. Her rallying cry, "Let's not shout, shall we?" Under Mildred's guidance, the citizens of Nether Snoosley practiced what she dubbed genteel insubordination. They staged peaceful sit-ins at the town bakery when the crumpets were too crispy. They filed politely worded objections when the church bell rang past bedtime. And, the rumour goes, they hosted the world's quietest protest. A group of citizens stood completely still for 6.5 minutes outside the mayor's house, holding placards that read, "Goodness, no thank you." Mildred espoused the radical idea that perhaps history didn't always need to be made loudly, that world-changing notions could come wrapped in well-steeped tea and whispery conversations had by creaky windows during gentle drizzles. She wrote a book to this effect entitled The Tremulous Philosophy of Gentle Refusal. 11 copies were printed, 12 if you count the one that was accidentally printed on upside-down ledger paper and used to line a birdcage. Yet her philosophy seeped through the mossy corners of society in ways nobody quite expected. A travelling librarian once borrowed her pamphlet and went on to start the first Hush Your Voice movement in East Belgravia. A poet from Basingstoke cited Mildred's maxim, "The loudest truths come in lowercase letters," before launching a literary magazine where everything was written in the whispers. But despite these minor ripples on the historically insignificant pond of impact, Mildred remained true to her village's proud tradition of unalertness. Her greatest dream had been to campaign for a blanket ban on shouting during council meetings. Alas, the only meeting she ever attended was cancelled on account of someone's ferret falling asleep on the gavel. Still, Mildred wasn't discouraged. she spent her later years in a state of mild satisfaction, wearing thick knitted cardigans and tending to her pet hedgehog, who she'd named Algernon after a boy she once argued with in 1892. The argument, it should be said, involved the best way to fold a gingham napkin. Tempers flared. Voices rose to nearly conversational level. It was the closest Nether Snoosley had come to a scandal in decades. Nowadays, Mildred's cottage stands as the official quiet thought centre, where visitors are encouraged to sit down, not interrupt the silence, and consider doing absolutely nothing for the duration of their stay. The visitor log is typically blank, though once, in 1974, a local librarian signed it in pencil, then immediately erased it out of modesty. There's a small plaque near her old armchair that reads, "Speak seldom, sleep often." And perhaps that's the true legacy of Mildred Thimblewisk. In a world that schools us to speak up and stand out, she stood in and sat down, and simply helped the world slow its pace, one comfortable slipper at a time. As the rain continues to drizzle and the village ducks commence their evening waddles, we drift onward, drawn by the scent of something warm baking in the next lane over. Something mysterious, possibly involving turnips. But that, dear dreamers, is another sleepy tale entirely. In the gently overcast spring of 1842, just after the hedgerows had begun their annual whisper of blossoms, and long before anyone had thought to invent a holiday worth cancelling work over, the village of Nether Middle Place decided to count all its spoons. Not forks, not knives, just spoons. Why? Well, my dear soporific scholar, boredom can inspire surprising ambition. And in a village where the most thrilling form of entertainment was watching moss migrate thoughtfully up the north wall of the town hall, counting utensils began to seem a noble civic duty. The idea was first floated, quite accidentally, by old Mrs. Bellingham Snoot during a meeting of the Ladies' Embroidery and Local Gossip Circle. She'd recently misplaced her favourite porridge spoon, one she claimed had a slight bend that cradled oats with maternal tenderness. "Perhaps we've too many spoons to begin with," she said, dabbing at her tea with a kerchief for reasons unknown to science or etiquette. To which Miss Winifred Tudge, mistress of the rarely played harpsichord, replied, "Indeed, how many spoons are there in this village? I'm not confident I've ever held all mine at once." A silence fell, a velvety, knowing, damp sort of silence only small, extremely damp villages can provide. And then, a decision was made almost by accident and also by general consensus. It was time for an official spoon census. The endeavour, while modest in concept, ballooned into what the Nether Middle Place Gazette would later refer to as the finest example of peacetime logistics this parish has ever known. 2 parish clerks, Edgar Wimple and his slightly more fastidious cousin Cedric, were appointed head enumerators. They wore identical wool coats 3 sizes too large and brandished clipboards engraved with the phrase, "Count thy spoon, ne'er assume." They went door to door, gently knocking, always with the same polite question. "Pardon the bother, but would you be so kind as to produce all spoons currently in your possession?" Some residents were delighted to comply. Mrs. Thimblewin, for instance, kept hers organised by curvature and silent judgment. Others, like the rarely seen Mr. Trilby, claimed philosophical opposition to spoons and instead offered a drawer of deeply suspicious ladles. The variety was astonishing. There were sugar spoons, soup spoons, egg spoons, and one particularly tiny one believed to be for stirring potions, or perhaps highly ceremonial desserts. Records show that 3 spoons were unearthed in a thatched roof. One was discovered in a boot, and another had been repurposed by the cooper's apprentice as a poorly functioning whistle. In total, after 21 cotton-socked days of meticulous counting, the village proudly logged 2,176 spoons. This in a hamlet of only 117 people. That's roughly 18.6 spoons per capita, more than double the national average at that time, which stood at just under 9. This statistic, though widely ignored by all other known publications, remains a point of pride inscribed in a modest bronze plaque outside the town hall. But here's where our tale dips its dainty silver toe into mystery. Among the spoons was one that didn't belong to anyone. A delicate tarnished teaspoon with an unknown heraldic insignia. A goose juggling 2 turnips. No household claimed it. No register mentioned it. And when the clerks attempted to catalogue it, it vanished overnight, only to reappear 6 days later in the postmistress's galoshes. To this day, the villagers speak of the spoon with no owner in hushed tones, though only if they've run out of jam-based topics. Some say it's cursed. Others believe it travels from village to village, appearing only during spoon-based head counts to teach humility, or balance, or proper cutlery storage. The lesson remains unclear, and thus the spoon census ended not with a clink, but with a very polite letter to the vicar noting that while the data was mostly sound, there remained one rogue spoon with possible enchantment issues. Still, a celebration was held. Tea was served. Tea cakes were consumed in a manner described as gentle yet determined, and a commemorative tea towel was issued bearing the slogan, "Spoons Count." The villagers went to bed that night proud, organised, and slightly more aware of their unexpected commitment to well-prepared breakfasts. And as the rain tickled the cobblestones softly under moonlight's yawn, the mysterious spoon glinted once more from beneath the postmistress's stairwell, hinting, ever so lightly, that boredom is never as boring as it seems. We mustn't wake it yet, but in the quiet morning that followed, another census was proposed, but not of spoons. No, something far fluffier. Let's drift forward slowly, toward that next curious count. As the low clouds curled themselves around the hills like a cat upon an old woolen jumper, the air in the village of Nether slowly thickened with the scent of wet leaves, boiled beets, and quiet anticipation. Autumn had arrived, not with fanfare or declarations, but with a resigned rustle and a soft sigh. And in Nether slowly, that meant only one thing. It was time for the annual slightly damp village picnic. Now, one must take care not to confuse this with the grand summer tea lawn social that was cancelled each year due to either drizzle or the surprise reappearance of hedgehog mating season. No, the slightly damp picnic was more reliable. Scheduled firmly in the 3rd week of October, it was always exactly as advertised. Slightly damp, moderately attended, and spectacularly unremarkable. The villagers emerged one by one in their traditional water-resistant woolen cloaks, itchy but honest, and gathered solemnly in the field behind Reverend Threadbare's vicarage, which was, incidentally, also his front yard. There, amidst the faded bunting reused since 1874, long wooden tables were stubbornly placed on muddy grass, each laden with a bounty of lukewarm root vegetables and scones baked to the consistency of limestone. But among the humble harvest of rutabagas and rhubarb pies sat a curious historical artifact that never failed to draw a thoughtful, if slightly confused, gaze. The Bramley biscuit bell. This odd tradition began, unsurprisingly, out of sheer boredom. During a particularly dull autumn in 1762, Miss Penelope Diggingworth Brown, spinster, potter, amateur beet weaver, had baked a biscuit so hard that, upon being dropped, it caused a tremor in the village sundial. Amused and having nothing else to do that week, the villagers declared it an omen and preserved the biscuit in a glass dome. Each year, it was rung like a bell to commence the picnic, though the ring sounded more like a reluctant cough. With the tolling of the biscuit, the villagers would queue quietly for food, greeting each other with the signature nether slowly expression of mild pleasure. One eyebrow raised no higher than 3 millimeters. Cuthbert Munch, the village's self-appointed Toastmaster General, had the great honor of delivering the annual reading of Ode to an Unbuttered Turnip, a poem thought to date back to before the Enclosure Acts, when most of the land was still considered public boredom. With the cadence of a man who once fell asleep giving a speech, he spoke, O turnip, thou root most bland, thou sitteth heavy in gut and in hand. We nibble thee slow, we chew without cheer. But still we are thankful thy harvest is here. And here, dear listener, is the curious part. None of this was ever for spectacle or pride, but simply a quiet way of being together without doing very much at all. The villagers of Nether Slowly had mastered the art of communal inactivity, and science, oddly enough, now agrees this may have been good for one's heart. Studies of rural 18th century village life suggest that, while many professions carried physical labor and danger, villages like Slowly, with modest demands and excessively long conversations about lint, produced residents with surprisingly healthy lifespans. Or perhaps it was the turnips, or the boredom acting as some sort of emotional sauna. Hard to tell. As the drizzle drooped into legitimate rain, Mrs. Hebe Blott refused to abandon her seat at the potato salad table. My cardigan's already damp, she explained. May as well make a day of it. This kind of stalwart drowsiness inspired morale. Soon the rest joined her in a soggy semicircle, cups of lukewarm nettle tea steaming like bored geysers, while a local trio, known affectionately as the faintly in-tune Minnows, strummed a dirge in D minor on violins strung with horsehair collected from particularly generous village ponies. By sunset, which arrived at 4:07 p.m. sharp, the picnic had shifted indoors to the Church of Mild Saints, whose bell tower was home to Britain's least accurate bell. It chimed whenever the mood struck, which was rarely. As villagers filed inside for a group reading of the parish laundry log, a local bestseller, if only by default, the scent of drying wool mingled with candle smoke and the occasional cherry cough drop. Outside, the rain continued its lullaby on the cobblestones, and beneath the rafters, someone was already nodding off in the back pew, dreaming perhaps of turnips, or of biscuit bells, or of nothing at all. Next, we shall drift to a quiet corner of the village where sleep was once declared illegal, for precisely 11 hours. As the soft rain resumed its rhythm on the mossy thatch roofs, and the chimney smoke swirled lazily into the twilight fog, our quiet little village nestled deeper into its lull of eternal unremarkableness. But even the dullest places, even the trance-like torpor of Lower Spindlethwaite, have their moments of mischief. Gentle mischief, mind you, the sort that involves sternly worded letters and slightly overdone root vegetables. Tonight, with fire crackling low and your blanket tucked just so, allow us to recount the curious case of the Great Turnip Rebellion, a most polite protest in the annals of agrarian indifference. It began, as most unrest does, with a committee. The Crop Rotation Appreciation Council, chaired by Mrs. Prudence Figsby, who wore a bonnet with the same structure and disposition as a Georgian prison, had decided, after 6 compelling hours of discussion, that the annual rotation of turnips to the west field should, in a bold break from tradition, rotate instead to the east. This sent shockwaves through the community, or would have had the community been awake for the whole meeting. As it stood, only 2 people noticed: old Perkins, who was asleep but upright in the front row, and Jemima Bottletop, who had come for the tea biscuits, stayed for the faint glimmer of bureaucratic chaos, and was now scribbling furious notes in a notebook labelled Village Scandals Hypothetical. Turnips, dear listener, are not naturally rebellious vegetables, nor would they inspire many revolutions. But to the villagers of Lower Spindlethwaite, whose collective excitement once peaked during the unveiling of a new postbox, unpainted for maximum suspense, this eastward turnip motion felt positively seismic. Now, let's not imagine pitchforks and torches. This was not that sort of rebellion. This was more of a standoff, a forgetting to water sort of mutiny. Mr. Lionel Crouch, local skeptic and self-appointed traditionalist, staged a symbolic protest by sowing all his turnips upside down, root out, leaf in, and claimed he would not rest, or at least not nap longer than 12 hours, until the council reversed its decision. A week later, one of his turnips regrew underground anyway. Nature, it seems, had little patience for symbolism. Meanwhile, the historical record, a dusty ledger kept in the church vestry behind a rather large spider named Bernice, does note that this was the only known moment when the parish clock tower rang at an unscheduled hour. Told once, mournfully, at 11:15, and several residents awoke from their slumbers mildly alarmed that time itself had misbehaved. The Reverend Horace Snoot, attempted to calm tensions with a sermon titled On the Eternal Nesting Peace of Root Vegetables and the Wisdom of Waiting, which consisted largely of reading aloud from an 1832 almanac while stroking a particularly serene radish. Calm returned more swiftly than it had departed, aided by several rounds of digestive biscuits and the realization that east and west didn't really make a great deal of difference when your main ambition was a well-behaved compost heap. In the end, the turnips grew. The rebellion fizzled, as gently as a snoozing badger. What remains of the event is a small wooden plaque near the east fields that reads, simply, "Here stood the slightly off-center turnip protest of 1877. It did not escalate." And so, dear listener, as clouds settle heavily over the damp fields and the hedgehogs begin their nightly conferences beneath the gooseberry bushes, we are reminded that not every revolution must be loud. Some are quiet, sleepy affairs, fought with sighs and lukewarm tea. And perhaps that's best. Let the rain fall. Let the teacups clink faintly in distant kitchens. Rest easy, for next, we shall wander into the tale of the village's most controversial doorbell, a riveting account of sound, scandal, and a retired bell ringer named Clive. While most villages are remembered for rousing revolts, romantic poetry, or at least a mildly dramatic tax dispute, the village of Nether Thicket earned its dusty footnote in history for something altogether leafier. Tonight, we drift into the tale of the most infamous event never to reach anyone's ears outside a 5-mile radius, the Grand Cabbage Incident of 1837. Nether Thicket, long considered the patron parish of pastoral indifference, had managed to avoid any excitement for centuries. It had no church fire, no scandalous vicar, not even a mistimed maypole dance. But in the late spring of 1837, the same year Queen Victoria was warming the throne with youthful ambition, something astonishing unfurled in Farmer Blodgett's garden patch. It began, as all great vegetable tales do, with an unusually early rain, a delighted earthworm population, and, fascinatingly, a surplus of ash from the previous winter's overly enthusiastic chimney-sweeping festival. Mixed together by chance and an aggressively curious hen named Winifred, this rare alchemy seemed to bestow one particular cabbage with ambitions previously unknown to bunch leaves. Now, let us be clear. This was, at its core, a cabbage. It did not speak. It did not campaign for office. But it grew, dear listener. Oh, how it grew. By mid-May, it was roughly the size of a modest wheelbarrow. By June, it began to draw quiet attention from neighbouring parishes. By early July, on the eve of St. Swithin's Day no less, it was formally measured and declared too large to ignore by the Society of Agrarian Quietude, a group dedicated to making sure no one made a fuss about crops. Naturally, this caused a ripple of alarm across the sleepy hamlet. You see, Nether Thicket's residents were deeply committed to boredom. They wore beige, practiced sighing recreationally, and took great effort to ensure nothing remarkable happened between sunrise and the 4:30 tea. But now, tourists, a terrifying word, began to trickle in. One young man from Shropshire even had the audacity to sketch the cabbage. They began calling it the Empire Sprout, which caused no shortage of eye-rolling amongst the elders, especially as it was, strictly speaking, not a sprout at all. To calm the situation, or at the very least, draw no further attention, the village council held an emergency meeting in the old gazebo behind Mrs. Tuppence's house. Now, an emergency meeting in Nether Thicket involved bringing out the good biscuits and reminding everyone to speak only when the spoon had been passed to them. During this genteel convocation, 3 resolutions were proposed. 1. That the cabbage be declared a natural aberration and offered quietly to the local poorhouse soup rotation. 2. That it be crowned and unveiled as King Leafy, celebrated once annually in a brief yet proud nod to novelty. 3. That it be moved stealthily under cover of a sulky dusk into a neighbouring village, thus solving 2 problems at once. Ultimately, after a full hour of intense murmuring, it was decided to do nothing, a tactic in which Nether Thicket excelled. The cabbage would be left to grow until it did not, and if anyone persisted in speaking about it, they were to be offered a long story about chimney suit ratios until they politely lost interest. By midsummer, the cabbage began to wither, as all cabbage must, and by October, it had collapsed in on itself with a sigh perhaps audible only to bats and poets. Its memory survived only in the gentle rustling of gossip over the harvest cider, and in a small footnote in the village ledger. July 1837, vegetables surpassed expectations, briefly. And yet, for a few enchanted weeks, the villagers had felt what it was like to be the epicenter of things, to watch strangers point and nod, to overhear words like colossal and peculiar, and to feel, in the silent green swirl of overgrown leaves, a kind of vegetable grandeur. It was a strange, sleepy summer, the kind that disappeared into mist, like all the best stories do. And speaking of mist and memory, in the next chapter, we shall amble quietly into Nether Thicket's most curious tradition, one involving spoons, bedtime, and a centuries-old lullaby sung only to turnips. As the drizzle returned with its usual whisper against thatched roofs and mossy cobbles, the village of Snorbury, noted for being the most restful place this side of human civilization, slipped softly into another chapter of mild obscurity. Tonight, we find ourselves in the candlelit chamber of a most peculiar governing body, the esteemed, the yawningly bureaucratic, and almost entirely vegetable-obsessed Cabbage Council. Now, you may be asking, surely this is fictional. No sane village would appoint an entire council strictly for cabbages. But I assure you, in 18th century Snorbury, nothing was deemed too mundane to warrant an official scroll. The year was 1738, and after a record-smashing year of medium-quality cabbage harvests, the village elders decided that cabbage, long seen as a humble side dish, deserved its own regulatory agency. Thus, the Cabbage Council was born. They met every Thursday afternoon, which sounds like an exciting decision, but mostly was picked because it didn't conflict with pudding forecasts on Wednesdays or goose allotment registers on Fridays. The council was composed of 5 members, each selected via a process known as the mild nod, wherein villagers quietly approved leadership candidates by nodding slightly at them over tea. The criteria were strict. Candidates must have grown at least 4 types of cabbage, own no loud clothing, and be capable of remaining silent for up to 90 minutes without appearing bored. The most famous of the early cabbage councillors was one Mortimer Plinth, a man of boundless neutrality. Mortimer once spoke for a full hour about the subtle differences between Savoy and spring cabbage leaf crinkles, and not a single audience member remained awake beyond minute 5. This was considered a mark of high statesmanship, their first and most legendary action, the 1738 Decree of Leaf Uniformity, a sweeping piece of legislation that attempted, quite bravely, to standardize the acceptable number of outer cabbage leaves presented at market stalls. Too few leaves, and one might suspect shabbiness. Too many, and suspicions of cabbage arrogance crept in. To enforce this, the council created the position of leaf auditor, a job so slow, so precise, and so gloriously unimportant that applicants had to undergo a test of patience, watching whitewash dry without dozing off. Only one man passed. He wasn't hired, as he'd nodded off 2 weeks later at a beetroot weigh-in. But his efforts are still spoken of, quietly, respectfully, and usually while peeling parsnips. And yet, this was Snorbury's charm, wasn't it? Power did not manifest in battles or bold decrees. It crept in like ivy, slowly and greenly. A cabbage, they said, doesn't demand to be noticed, but it changes a stew entirely. In this village, boredom was not the absence of excitement. It was the presence of untroubled minds. The decree of 1738 would live on well into the 1800s, surviving briefly even the great outbreak of Brussels sprout envy in 1812, a time many in the village simply referred to as the slightly bitter month. But still, the council persisted, approving or gently rejecting cabbage displays with a slow nod and the occasional approving murmur. Outside the council chamber, the rain painted streaks down the windows, dripping in metronomic tempo. The pub next door, the Parsnip's Elbow, served its nightly lukewarm stew, while the chimneys puffed out curls of drowsy smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep yawned. Historical records suggest the Cabbage Council eventually disbanded not through scandal, but through a mutual agreement to nap. Their meeting minutes simply stopped being written after someone inked the phrase, "All agreed to continue doing what we usually do, unless we forget." But perhaps that is the true legacy of the Cabbage Council. Not their impact, nor their decisions, but the unshakable belief that even the most leaf-based matters deserve care, pause, and a council to listen silently, patiently, and with utmost leafy consideration. As the village clock softly announced the hour with 2 muffled tocks, one slightly late, the council chamber settled for the night. Lanterns were dimmed. Coats were gently folded over wicker chairs. Somewhere, probably, a cabbage blushed modestly under moonlight. And just as the mist curled tighter around the hedgerows, something else stirred down by the stream. a quiet place where a most unexpected discovery had begun to change the very fabric of Snorbury's sleepy identity. In the damp and drowsy heart of the village, tucked between the biscuit-coloured post office and the gently leaning lamplight known to flicker only during sentences, stood what the locals generously called the Grand Library of Lower Nether Bipple. Do not let the name mislead you. It was neither grand nor particularly lower. In fact, due to a cartographic mishap in 1783, the entire lower part of the village became technically uphill. Maps still lie about it to this day. And the library, well, it was roughly the size of a polite shed. Perhaps the kind of shed you wouldn't mind being stuck in during a slow drizzle with a very quiet librarian. The librarian's name was Mrs. Petunia Underwillow, a woman who spoke barely above a whisper unless asked about the Dewey Decimal System, in which case she would launch into a gentle fugue of numerical ecstasy. She had once categorized every pamphlet, including the ones warning about pamphlet misuse. To say she loved her job would be misleading. Petunia Underwillow revered her calling with the hushed intensity of a monk alphabetizing clouds. The library held precisely 1,083 books. It had held 1,084, but one had gone missing in 1927, and a small knitted sign still hung by the door offering 1 tuppence for its safe return. The missing volume was titled How to Tell If a Cat is Planning Something Suspicious, and its disappearance remained the village's only unsolved mystery, not due to complexity, but due to the village's general disinterest in cats. You see, Lower Nether Bipple had only one cat, and she had retired from plotting in 1911. Now, most of the books were gently unread. They sat quietly, spines softened with time, pages curling slightly at the edges like the sleepy toes of an old man's dream. There was, for example, a full set of the annual spoon weighing reports, 1843-1906. A proud local tradition, spoon weighing had once been the village's main claim to fame, until a rival town, Upper Falklington, accused them of tampering with teaspoon calibration. Then came the Great Utensil Scandal of 1891, which we mustn't get into too deeply unless we're prepared to nap through a century of parliamentary pudding debates. Perhaps the most curious artifact in the library, however, lived not on a shelf, but in the return box, a musty wooden cube with a note declaring in looping ink, "Return books gently, do not alarm the poetry." The artifact in question was known only as the folded map. The folded map was said to be a cartographic oddity, lovingly illustrated in 1766 by a man named Cyril Beeblethwaite, who was determined to put every known public bench in England onto one single map. Unfortunately, folds became necessary. Many, many folds. So many, in fact, the map now resembled a slightly irritable accordion. Some said it folded into itself so many times it was technically a black hole of picnic data. No one dared open it fully anymore, for fear of vanishing into a county no longer in existence. The most recent attempt had been carried out by Petunia herself during the quiet spring of 1982. The unfolding lasted 6 days. She survived by drinking condensed milk and reading aloud to a concerned nearby spider named Rudyard. When she emerged, she swore she had seen an alternate version of Lower Nether Bipple, where the lamplighter was paid in marmalade and everyone knew how to play the bassoon. These were the sorts of stories the books whispered to one another when the library was closed, and the rain tapped on the windows like a shy percussionist. There was legend, too, of a ghostly book reviewer named Eustace Shamblethorpe, who wandered the shelves muttering things like overuse of semicolons, and Chapter 3 lacked emotional spoon depth. No one had seen him, but several books had mysteriously acquired helpful footnotes in margins. the clearest sign of a poltercritic at work, so the library stayed forgotten, but content, a soggy sanctuary of quiet knowledge and badly drawn maps. Petunia placed the kettle near the stack of overdue gardening memoirs, books with titles like Compost and Consequences and Ferns I've Met. Outside, the puddles gathered in tight little circles, gossiping with the raindrops. And in this softened world beneath a mist-grey sky, something very quiet and quite impossible had begun to stir on shelf 7B. But we'll get to that in just a moment. And so, the rain continues, softly, dutifully, and quite politely. In the most boring village in the world, the drops have neither urgency nor aim. They simply arrive, as they always have, tapping gently upon windows, collecting gracefully in the rusted scoop of the village bell, naturally silent, for no one has ever really needed to ring it. A sheep mutters something unintelligible to no one in particular. A sloping hill exhales, and time, just as it did yesterday, and just as it seems determined to do tomorrow, stretches like an old cat by the fire of a memory. Here, in Dulford upon Mumble, night arrives like a velvet curtain lowering over a stage where absolutely nothing has happened, again. And somehow, that nothing feels like everything. Take, for instance, the village cabbage. You may remember, or not, who could blame you if your thoughts have already drifted away like a paper boat into dream water? That Dulford's economy once depended entirely on cabbages, specifically a variety known as the blue-tinted buttonhead, which is exactly as thrilling as it sounds. The exciting part. The cabbages grew slightly sideways, not due to any particular agricultural innovation, but because the village soil was a bit indecisive. For centuries, the townspeople held an annual sideways cabbage appreciation afternoon, not a festival. Festivals imply dancing. This was more of a seated event involving the quiet contemplation of vegetative angles. Old Mr. Plunkett once brought a ruler, but people said that was too radical, and it hasn't happened since. The Nobel Committee was never notified. And yet, in its own creaky, cobwebbed rhythm, Dulford has achieved something most places never do. It has mastered the art of gentle persistence. It is a masterclass in atmospheric neutrality, where the air contains no ambition, only the pleasant aroma of damp leaves, lukewarm barley tea, and faintly mouldy books that haven't been opened since the reign of King Edward the Moderately Memorable. Speaking of books, have I told you of the librarian? Miss Featherbottom, 79 and caffeinated exclusively by chamomile, has presided over the Dulford Reading Room for 6 decades. No one's quite sure when she took over. She just gradually started showing up earlier than the previous librarian, until he stopped appearing altogether. Some say she papered over him. Figuratively, of course. Bookish figures have that sort of decay. Each Thursday, Miss Featherbottom reads aloud from tax codes of the 12th century, a riveting collection of medieval fiscal decisions that managed to exclude both drama and conclusion. Her voice is like chamomile in sound form, soothing, a bit floral, and slightly prone to drifting off mid-sentence. But tonight, even she is silent. In her comfortable chair by the frosted window, she has fallen asleep, mid-chapter. The book sags slightly on her lap, her spectacles perched daringly at the tip of her nose, as though contemplating a career change. Nearby, the grandfather clock peeps more than it chimes, shyly offering the hour before curling back into its walnut casing. Outside, between the hedges meticulously trimmed to resemble broader hedges, the village rests. Not a single porch light flickers. No goats are plotting anything. and even the weather vane, shaped inexplicably like a spoon, points nowhere in particular. It spins a little, then thinks better of it. If you were to walk through the village now, silently, warmly wrapped, each footstep swallowed in mud-soft whispers, you'd see curtains drawn, kettles boiled, and the soft silhouette of someone inevitably mending socks. Dulford hasn't had political unrest since the Great Biscuit Misunderstanding of 1913, and even that was mostly resolved by tea. You may ask, what is the point of such glorious dullness? What lies at the heart of this enduring yawn of a village? Perhaps, dear listener, the secret is this. In a world rarely still, in time that rarely lingers, Dulford upon Mumble is a pause, a drowsy comma at the edge of centuries, a place where the most exciting thing that ever happened was the arrival of a particularly symmetrical puddle. And that, in itself, is a wonder. The puddle, by the way, remains, untroubled, undrained. So as the rain hums its soft bedtime chant, and the chimney smoke curls like lazy ghosts stretching before sleep, we leave Dulford not with a bang, heavens no, but with a sigh, a yawn, a well-earned nap for the waking mind. Draw your blanket up a little tighter, inhale the hush, exhale the day, and drift, as the villagers do, into a sleep more restful than a sun-warmed stone, more uneventful than a Tuesday in February, and more comforting than a slightly overboiled potato. Farewell for now, dear dreamer. May your sleep be as deep and as thrillingly uneventful as Dulford itself.